Yo, what's up guys, Alfie, and today I'm going to be doing an analysis or kind of a breakdown of all the deck lists from Arena Championship 2. So it's been a very long time since we had a Premier Historic event, so I thought it could be interesting to just look at all the deck lists that people brought to this tournament, look at the innovations that people made and whether that could change how the archetypes are built going forwards, and just talk about how the metagame might shift after how, certain decks are doing well at this tournament as well. Now we're obviously getting Shadows over Innistrad Remastered later today, which I do think is going to have a pretty big impact on the format, but I thought it could still be useful to just have a look at these deck lists, have a look at what people brought, what things did well, and what innovations could change the meta going forwards as well. So before I get into it, I do want to acknowledge that this was a very small tournament, right? It's only 32 players. And so I'm sure there are some innovations that were made for a very targeted metagame that might not necessarily translate as well into ladder play, for example. And I'm also sure that there are, some decks might have just had bad variants and still be good. So I'm not going to have too much judgment based on the performance of these decks, but I thought it could just be interesting to look at the lists and see how the metagame could evolve going forward. So I'm going to start off by having a look at the metagame breakdown here. So kind of expected this, but the mid-range decks were the most popular, right? We had 22% Jan mid-range and 13% Rakdos midrange. Now, I'm kind of surprised that it was that way round. I'm personally a much bigger fan of Rakdos than Jun, just because I feel like, the Rakdos midrange deck is already tight for space, right? You already have too many good options to fit into the deck, and so I don't really feel like the green splash is worth it. Now, obviously, Jostle is an incredibly good card, but you do lose consistency in the mana base. You do get to run fewer creature lands, which I think is a pretty big deal as well. So I kind of expected these to be the other way round, but it's interesting that a lot of people thought that Jund was better. Maybe I could see them thinking that mid-range is going to be super popular and Jund might have an advantage in the mid-range mirror matches, but interesting to see that this panned out this way. Kethis Combo at 5. Now, I did expect Kethis to be popular. I spoke to Ondrej Strasky briefly before the tournament, and I knew that he was bringing Kethis, and I'm not really surprised. I think Kethis has always been a really good deck that's very difficult to build and play, so I always think it's definitely underplayed relative to how good it is, and the new Jace from the latest set is such a big upgrade to that deck. You now don't have to run Diligent Excavator, which was definitely the weak link in that deck, so I think Kethis is an incredibly good deck, and I'm not shocked that 5 people thought it would be good for this tournament, and it is a very good deck. I expect to see a lot more of it going forwards. Then 5 Mardu Reanimator. Now, I know a team worked on this deck, and I had seen people doing well with Reanimator recently as well, so I wasn't too shocked to see this here, and it did perform pretty well from what I saw. Matti Kuisma, I think, was the only undefeated player going into the top 8, and so this deck does look like it's got legs. I'm definitely excited to break it down when we get to that. Then we only got 2 artifact decks. I am quite surprised about this. I guess people were scared of Brotherhood's End, and, Crucius being able to tutor Shatterstorm is pretty big if there's a lot of mid-range decks in the format. So I did expect to see a few more artifact decks, but, I'm happy that some people brought this because I do think it's still a really good deck in the metagame. And then the other decks, the rest are all one-off decks. Izzet Wizards, which end up winning the whole thing that I'm going to talk about in a minute. Jeskai Creativity, which is trying to cheat Sarah's Emissary into play, which seems pretty reasonable, not bad. Rakdos Goblins is a deck that I did think would be more popular, right? Coming into this, I did expect mid-range to be the most popular deck, and I think that Rakdos Goblins is one of the best decks against the mid-range deck, so I did expect this to be slightly more, but I think whoever brought this did make a good metagame call. Then Esper Pact, I'm not surprised to see the Pact deck being played here. Now again, it's another deck that's very difficult to build because, you have to run all one-offs basically, so, a lot of work needs to go into building this sort of deck, but Esper Pact also managed to make the top 8, so I think this was a good call as well. Izzet Phoenix? This is another deck that I expected to see here. I didn't know if I'd see it in high numbers, but, similar to Kethis, I think Phoenix is a deck that is quite hard to play, and can be hard to build in certain situations as well. And so in a field of, 32 really good players who've managed to grind through all the qualifiers to get here, I'm not at all surprised to see Phoenix here. Hammer Time is an interesting one. I feel obviously this is kind of a new archetype that's been enabled by the Kemba's Outfitter. I didn't really expect to see this here because I do feel like Hammer Time is going to struggle in a metagame full of mid-range. Obviously, we're getting Sigarda's Aid. I'm not sure how much of a difference that'll make in terms of the mid-range matchups, but I felt like in a metagame full of mid-range, this is a very risky choice, and I don't think it ended up working out for the Hammer Time player. But again, I didn't get to see all their matches, so I'm not really 100% sure how that panned out for them. And then Grixis midrange is essentially Rakdos splashing blue for some counter spells as far as I'm aware, so we can kind of lump this in with the Rakdos midrange deck a little bit. And then mono white auras, not surprised to see auras here. A little surprised to see mono white rather than, I've seen some multicolored variants or blue white. I think there's an argument for going white green as well. But not surprised to see Auras here. You know, I think a lot of people think that Auras has a bad matchup into Rakdos, and I don't think it's your favorite matchup from the Auras side, but I think it's a lot closer than people realize. So, you know, not surprised to see Auras here either way. So, Metagame Breakdown is kind of what I expected. I did expect to see a little bit more Rakdos Goblins and a little bit more of the Artifact decks. And like I said, I did expect Rakdos to be more popular than Jund, but not super shocked, especially if people thought that Jund had the edge in the mirror match. So, I'm going to start off by having a look at the deck that won the whole tournament, which was Izzet Wizards. And I did not expect Wizards to win this because, you know, Izzet Wizards is traditionally a deck that is very fast and powerful, but just has a pretty bad matchup against the mid-range decks, which were the most popular going into this tournament. But I think Hiroshi Onizuka, I hope I don't butcher the name there, did a really good job innovating on this deck to give it a much better matchup against the mid-range deck. So the first thing to note here that is in kind of the stock lists that's not being run here is Reckless Charge, and I think that's a huge change. I think Reckless Charge is generically very powerful, but in a field full of fatal pushes and you know, instant speed interaction from the Rakdos midrange and Jund midrange decks, not running Reckless Charge is huge because that's just a complete blowout if the opponent has removal. So not running that, I'm a really big fan of. They're also running 8 of the draw 2 the card advantage spells for Expressive Iteration, for Mentor's Guidance, which again I think is a really good choice in a Rakdos metagame or like a mid-range metagame, because those sorts of decks are all about trading 1-for-1, and so running a bunch of cards in your deck that provide 2-for-1s is really nice. Now Mentor's Guidance isn't as clean as a way to get ahead in these mid-range matchups as Expressive Iteration, because the opponent can kill your creature in response to the Mentor's Guidance, so you don't get the copy of it. But I still think it's a great choice, right? If you have a wizard in play and it survives, you get to start pulling ahead on card advantage. So this is really, really great. I think if you're still expecting the mid-range decks to be very popular, this definitely seems like a much better way to build the Wizards deck. They're also running Violin of Sea and Sky, which is another big innovation, and I can understand why this is in the deck. Basically, it's hard for a lot of decks to kill and just produces card advantage, because the big weakness of Wizards in general is that if you get all your creatures killed, you kind of just completely run out of gas. And so Violin, being a hard to kill creature that can just constantly produce card advantage, ensures that you can just keep grinding into longer games, which is really huge. So, and then outside of that, we've got Brazen Burrower here, just more generic interaction. It kind of gets around the problem that Wizards has had of dealing with bigger creatures, right? You're reliant on red damage-based removal, so being able to bounce stuff at instant speed is really huge, and it obviously doubles up as another threat as well, which is really nice. And then Reckless Rage is another really nice card. You know, I think the ability to deal 4 damage is really huge, particularly against the artifact decks with Retrofit Foundry. Being able to kill the Foundry tokens for 1 mana is really huge. So I really like a lot of what's going on in this deck. I think Hiroshi did a really, really great job innovating this into a mid-range metagame. You know, Wizards is definitely a deck that preys on the non-mid-range or the non-interactive decks and tends to struggle against the interactive decks. And I think what Hiroshi's done here is basically make the deck a little bit less fast, but you still have the key cards here, right? You've still got the Dreadful Arcanist and the Symmetry Sage and the Wizard's Lightning and Consider and stuff like that. So you still have the explosivity there, but you're just less vulnerable to interaction. So again, I think this is more innovations to do with the metagame that was expected, but I still think mid-range is going to be very popular going forward. So I do think that this could probably be a better way to play this on ladder, just to improve your mid-range matchup while still having the explosivity that Wizards is known for. So really, really great metagame choice. Did not expect Wizards to win, but I really like a lot of what's going on in this deck list. The next one we've got Izzet Phoenix. So this was the second place deck. Interesting to see 2 Izzet decks here. Now, I did expect Phoenix to do relatively well here, because I see Phoenix as kind of Izzet Wizards, but more resilient to interaction. And the list here is pretty nice. You know, quite a lot of stock stuff going on here. We've got Channeler, Shredder, obviously we've got the 4 Phoenixes here, 2 Symmetry Sage, 2 Ox. I like that split. You know, Symmetry Sage is an extra early threat, is really nice, and Ox is just such a powerful way to refuel, gives you more redundancy for your discard outlets. And then everything else is kind of stock here. You know, I do like the 2 Lightning Axe. I feel like that's very important right now with Shieldred being tutorable by Crucius. You know, if you're expecting to see a lot of Rakdos, you do need to make sure you've got answers to Shieldred in the main deck, because they can consistently tutor up the Shieldred. And then, you know, rest of the main deck seems pretty stock, but, you know, very nicely built deck here, I think. 2 Spikefield Hazard is interesting because they did board it out quite a lot, but I can understand why. It just gives you extra consistency, gives you that extra spell, and enables you to kill stuff like Esper Sentinel, Llanowar Elves, and Thalia early in the game as well. So I like this a lot. Then in terms of the sideboard, nothing too crazy going on here. You know, Brotherhood's End is obviously great against the Go Wide decks and the Artifact decks. You got some Graveyard Hate. Crackling Drake is a really nice post sideboard when the opponent's bringing Graveyard Hate against you. And then just, you know, some extra pieces of interaction, some counter spells for the control matchups. Narset as a one-of seems really nice as well. So yeah, this list, you know, nothing too crazy going on here, but it seems really solidly built. And again, I'm not too shocked Phoenix did well, especially in the hands of a good pilot. The next up, we've got Rakdos Midrange. So this is from Jan-Moritz Merkel, and this is definitely my favourite of the mid-range decks that were run this weekend. I know that they've been doing really well with Arcanist. I think they qualified for this tournament running Rakdos Arcanist. And I do think, you know, there's definitely an argument to playing this going forwards. I do think Historic right now has less Graveyard Hate than it has in the past, which I think is a big reason why the Mardu Reanimator decks were able to do very well. And so because of that, I think Arcanist is a pretty good choice. Now, obviously, you've got a compare it to Bloodtithe Harvester. That's kind of the other card that fills the same slot as this. And Arcanist, you do have to build around it a little bit more, but not too much. All you basically have to do is move some of your interaction from the 2-mana slot to the 1-mana slot. So, for example, he's only running 1 Molten Impact and just running 4 Strangle as interaction that you can consistently hit off the Arcanist, which is not too much of a, you know, change to be able to enable Arcanist. So I could very well see Arcanist being a good choice going forwards. I still think Bloodtithe Harvester is pretty good though, right? You have it as the loot effect, which can help fix your hand, turn Revolt on for Fatal Push, acts as early interaction against the opponent, and gives you a really strong late game engine when paired alongside Fable of the Mirror Breaker. So if Crucius does get nerfed to the point it's unplayable in Historic, I could potentially see builds of Rakdos Midrange that run Fable of the Mirror Breaker, Seasoned Pyromancer, Bloodtithe Harvester, and Arcanist, and just not run as many 3-drops, which seems pretty appealing to me. But yeah, like Arcanist is obviously a great card in this archetype, and then the rest of the deck, 4 Seasoned Pyromancer, just possibly the best card in the whole archetype, honestly. Fable of the Mirror Breaker, even without Bloodtithe Harvester, is obviously an insane card. You know, Fable with Pyromancer gives you a really strong late game engine. I'm a big fan of 2 Croxer right now. I've recently changed my list to include the second Croxer. I think Croxer is such a powerful threat, gives you a strong late game. Now, running 4 Arcanist 2 Croxer does make the deck a little bit vulnerable to Graveyard Hate, but like I said, coming into this tournament, I don't think Graveyard Hate was expected to be that popular, and so I think you can definitely get away with this right now. If the metagame shifts to run more Graveyard Hate, then this could be a little bit of a liability, but you do have a lot of ways to answer Graveyard Hate, right? You've got a Braid and other, like Kodogan's Command, as ways to kill Unlicensed Hearse, which is the most commonly played Graveyard Hate right now, so I could see this still being good going forwards. 2 Crucius is kind of a surprise. I think this card is obviously incredibly powerful, but like I said, it's hard to fit everything you want in the Rakdos deck, and I do think Pyromancer is better than Crucius in this archetype, and Fable is obviously insane as well. You know, Crucius being legendary can be a drawback, but you know, you can discard other copies of it to the Crucius, so but yeah, I like a lot of what's going on in this. Main deck Unlicensed Hearse was a great metagame call, considering, you know, people were bringing Phoenix and Reanimator. I think the first copy of Unlicensed Hearse is really powerful compared to additional copies because it does have diminishing returns, but I like the one main deck on Licensed Hearse, and if decks like Reanimator are more popular going forwards, this could be a good innovation to just run in your main decks generally. Anyway, then obviously a lot of 1-mana interaction to enable the Arcanist, you know, Fatal Push. Spikefield Hazard is obviously great here as just additional lands that you can also get value off with the Arcanist, which seems pretty nice as well. Then sideboard-wise, Hidetsugu is obviously going to be good against the Artifact decks and just other decks that have a lot of 1-drops in. Unlicensed Hearse is Graveyard Hate. Go Blank is kind of discard spell and Graveyard Hate as well. Now, one thing that I really like about this particular build that I saw a lot of other decks not doing is only running 1 card to get with Crucius consistently, right? So they're only running Shieldred as a card that costs more than 3, so Crucius is guaranteed to be able to find the Shieldred. So that means that they can run cards like Shatterstorm that Crucius can tutor for, Extinction Event, which is obviously going to be good against decks like Mono Green Devotion, and just bigger creature decks, go wide creature decks as well. Slaughter Games is a really great choice. So this was in my Crucius Rakdos Midrange deck a while back when the Trap Finder deck was still legal as a way to get rid of Ominous Traveler to win. And with the, I expect to see Kethis seeing more play. This seems like a great card to just completely pick apart the Kethis deck, right? You can play Crucius, discard a 3-drop, name Ambitious, get the Slaughter Games, and then you can just remove Kethis from the opponent's deck, and that basically guarantees you're going to win. So if Kethis is a big part of the format, I think Slaughter Games is a really nice choice to tutor up off the Crucius, and then obviously Brotherhood's End for artifact decks. So this is definitely my favourite build of mid-range from the weekend. I think Arcanist could be a great choice going forwards. Like I said, if Crucius gets nerfed, I could see builds wanting to run Arcanist and Bloodtithe Harvesters together to make the deck a little bit more low to the ground. So big fan of this list. Then we get onto the Mardu Reanimator deck. So this is another big innovation. Now I did see some Reanimator decks going into this weekend, but this seems like a really, tuned build of it. Like I said, Matti Kuisma was the only player to go undefeated into the top 8. I think they did lose their first match in the top 8, so could have just been bad variance in that match, but I like this deck a lot. It basically plays like a mid-range deck that has a reanimation package, which seems really efficient against other mid-range decks, because you're basically just going bigger than them, but you still have a lot of the consistency tools that the mid-range decks have. So Atraxa is the main reanimation target in the deck. You've obviously got Priest of Fell Rights here as a way to reanimate it on turn 3, which is really huge. Crucius is obviously great here because it can tutor the Atraxa and then discard it as well. It's another discard outlet, ramps you as well, which is really nice. We got Bloodtithe Harvester as just a generically good mid-range card that can also pitch your Atraxa to the graveyard. For Fable, another way to pitch to the graveyard that's just a generically good mid-range tool that also works well with your Bloodtithe Harvester. Then 4 Unburial Rites as another, gives you more redundancy for the reanimation. The fact it has flashback is really huge because unlike the Priest of Fell Rites, I guess Priest of Fell Rites can also be cast from the graveyard, but if the opponent Thought Seizes you, and you have Priest of Fell Rites or Unburial Rites, it's kind of awkward for the mid-range opponent there because you can just reanimate stuff from your graveyard, which is pretty huge. Then you got 4 Thoughtseize as just, great generic interaction that you can also target yourself as an extra discard outlet if you need to pitch Atraxa to the graveyard, which is nice. And then some extra piece of interaction. Fragment Reality is really nice here as just extra interaction. Now the weakness of Fragment Reality is if you use it to kill bigger creatures, you're still giving your opponent another creature, so it doesn't, act as a clean answer, but in a deck that's going way over the top with Atraxa, that's not really much of an issue. And it can take out every piece of graveyard hate, right? You can use this to take out Soulguide Lantern, Rest in Peace, Unlicensed Hearse, so I think Fragment Reality works really well in this deck. Then 25 lands I think is a good call. I've been saying for a long time that these decks that really want to be casting your 3-drops on curve like Crucius and Fable, you kind of want to be running 25 lands because it's an absolute disaster if you miss your 3rd land drop on curve. And then sideboard-wise, they've got Ceres Emissary here as kind of a swap-in for Atraxa against decks that struggle to deal with it. Stuff like Goblins or Auras, for example. Monogreen Devotion can struggle to deal with it sometimes as well. So Emissary seems like a nice extra reanimation target in particular matchups. And you got K-Command as a way to kill graveyard hate like Unlicensed Hearse and just give you good value, enable you to grind better against the mid-range decks. More copies of Fragment Reality I'm a big fan of, like I said. More interaction, bit of graveyard hate as well. And then Gigantha is pretty huge in this deck as well because it can give you a way to hardcast the Atraxa if the opponent has your graveyard unlocked, for example, right? You can just cast the Gigantha, then activate its mana ability to just cast Atraxa from your hand. So I think this deck is really cool. I do think this is the sort of deck that is going to struggle if the metagame adapts to it, right? Because, obviously graveyard hate, if it becomes more popular, is going to make this deck slightly harder to play. But having said that, the fact that this plays like a mid-range deck means that if the opponent does mulligan hard to graveyard hate, you can just win with your mid-range plan anyway. Or like I said, you can just hardcast the Atraxa off Gigantha anyway. So I do think this deck is a great metagame choice when there isn't much graveyard hate. Even when there is graveyard hate, I do think the deck can adapt and can still win because of the mid-range plan they've got baked in here as well, which is pretty nice. And next we've got Esper Pact. So I'm not going to be able to go through every single card in this deck, obviously, because it's all one-offs, but it's interesting to see White as the 3rd card. I've seen a lot of people playing Grixis Pact that gives you more threats that enable you to win the game, like Crackling Drake and Lalia can both win you the game off Tainted Pact. And you've obviously got access to Crucius as well, which is a really nice tool in a deck full of one-offs as well. But I can see why you'd want to go into White. You get access to some really nice board sweepers like Wrath of God and Divine Purge. The real innovation here is the 3rd copy of Tainted Pact. So normally you just run 2 copies of Tainted Pact so that you can just immediately go off. Now it's interesting. I've never run a deck with 3 Tainted Pact before, but I can kind of see why you'd want to do this because it basically enables you to free roll the 1st copy of Tainted Pact. You can just use it as a tutor. Now the obvious weakness of running 3 copies here is that it costs you more mana to go off, right? You need, if you have, for example, that win on turn 4 with Tainted Pact and Jace, you have to Tainted Pact twice, right? You Tainted Pact the first one to find another Tainted Pact, and then after Tainted Pact to get your library down to however many cards to win with the Jace, which does mean that you're less able to consistently win in the early game, but running 3 copies does mean that you can just, like I said, use that first copy as a tutor effect and not have to worry going forwards, which is it's very interesting. I've never run a deck with 3 Tainted Pact before. I can't really analyze this deck too much because I haven't played Tainted Pact myself that much, but if there are other advantages of running the 3rd copy of Tainted Pact, if there's any Pact players in the comments, definitely let me know what you think of this innovation, because it's pretty interesting. But yeah, overall, a lot of really good cards in here. I guess the main difference between this list and other lists that I've built myself or seen is that there are a lot of expensive top-end cards, right? We've got Torrential Gearhulk, there was Discover the Formula, Sublime Epiphany, all very expensive cards, which is kind of a surprise because I feel like the pack decks, from my experience, have always struggled the most against the fast aggressive decks, but I think that might be a metagame call more than anything else, because if you're expecting a lot of slower mid-range decks, which was the most popular deck going into this weekend, having much more, those games are going to go long, they're very grindy, so having a lot of very high impact expensive cards allows you to just have good top decks going into those sorts of matchups. So I can see these being good into a field full of mid-range, but if I was to play Pact on the ladder, I don't know if I would feel safe running so many expensive cards. But again, I'm not 100% sure. I haven't played Pact in a while, so I'm sure the better Pact players can weigh in on that in the comments maybe. And then sideboard, just a lot of different stuff here for different matchups. Scarab God, which seems very, very good against the Rakdos decks, for example. Thieving Skydiver against the Artifact decks. So very interesting deck. I'm sure a lot of work went into building this deck. Tainted Pact decks are very difficult to build. I still don't know if I prefer Esper to Grixis, particularly on ladder. I think the Grixis decks, just having more ways to close the game out with Tainted Pact, appeals to me slightly more, but I haven't played with this deck at all, so it could be the possibility that once I do actually get some games in with this, it changes my mind. And this does feel like much more of a control deck than a mid-range deck, and I think Grixis plays more like a mid-range deck, but very cool deck. Had a lot of success this last weekend with it as well. Then we get on to Rakdos mid-range deck. So this is a different build. I think a few of the players like Yuuki, Ichikawa were tested together on a team, because I think there are a few other decks that are the exact 75 of this. And the main things here that are interesting to me is seeing Bonecrusher Giant here instead of Seasoned Pyromancer, which I'm not sure I really understand personally. Like, I get that Bonecrusher Giant is a good card, but I feel like Seasoned Pyromancer is just one of, if not the best cards in the whole archetype. So maybe I'm missing something here. I don't really understand. Like, it is nice having early interaction. Maybe they expected more creature decks. But yeah, I just feel like Seasoned Pyromancer is such a powerful card in this deck. And I just feel like Crucius and Fable are also better than Bonecrusher Giant. So I am a little bit surprised to see this. Maybe people can weigh in the comments what the purpose of this was, what kind of decks they might have been expecting to bring the Bonecrusher Giant here. They're also running Invoke Despair in addition to Shielded. Like I said, I'm not a huge fan of running multiple cards at the top end. I more value the consistency of finding a target every single time, but I can see why, particularly in a mid-range metagame, why you would want to have more diverse threats to be able to get off Crucius, and in general just having more threats at the top of your curve to be able to go over the top of the other mid-range decks. So in a mid-range, metagame where there's a lot of other mid-range decks, having Invoke Despair, having 3 copies of Shielded seems like a way to go over the top of the opponent. Two copies of Croxer is very nice. I'm a big fan of that, like I said earlier. And then sideboard-wise, nothing too special going on here. Rending Volley is a card we don't see very often, but I can see why that's there. Extra copy of Invoke Despair is a way to go over the top of the other mid-range decks. 3 Bankbuster. So this list seems like it's very tuned to beat other mid-range decks, especially post-sideboard. So I can see this being a good metagame call for the weekend. But like I said, I'm not 100% sure why they decided to go for the Bonecrusher Giant over Seasoned Pyromancer. So maybe you guys can let me know in the comments. The next up, we've got Kethis Combo from Ondrej Strasky. So I did speak to Ondrej briefly before the tournament, and he did mention that he was running this deck, and I think that this deck is super powerful right now. Like I said, I think Kethis has always been a good deck in the format, just underplayed because it's so difficult to play, and it's also quite difficult to build as well. And I think the deck has gone up in power level massively because of the addition of Jace. You don't have to run Diligent Excavator anymore. Now, this list is very similar to the list that Omri Thopter on Twitter. I'll leave his Twitter in the description. If you're interested in playing this game, I 100% recommend you go and check out Omri's recent article on MTGAs and on this deck. It's a really, really in-depth breakdown about the deck, the choices, the different innovations you can make, breaking down all the combos. It's such an in-depth article, so if you're interested in picking up Kethis, definitely check his article out. I'll link it down in the description, but I really like a lot of what's going on here, right? You've got the key cards, we've got Jace, which is the new addition. You've obviously got Kethis. Emry is very important. Kinnan is really important at just ensuring that you have enough mana to go off on combo turns as well, enabling you to have explosive turns in the early game off the Moxamba. Lazav, interestingly, they've only gone for 2 copies rather than 3. I've seen 3 or 4 copies in certain lists, but I can understand why they've only gone down to 2 here. And then Relic of Legends is just one of the best cards in the archetype as well. Just gives you another way to win looping Emry once you have Kethis in play. Ruinous Blast is just the best card in certain matchups. Assemble the team kind of working as extra copies of Grizzly Salvage. I have seen some of this running Scroll over the Grizzly Salvage. Having spoken to Omri before, he's been doing a lot of work on this deck. I do understand that that's quite a close decision, but I think the main reason that they decided not to go for Scroll is just because the mana base has always been the weakest part of this deck, right? It's, you don't have a consistent mana base in 4 colors really, and needing white on turn 1 is a very big issue. So just for consistency's sake, I think that's the main reason why they've gone for Grizzly Salvage over Scroll. Also just enables you to find your Kethis more consistently, which is the most important thing in this deck. And then sideboard wise, like I said, check out Omri's article because he explains tons of the sideboard decisions, but Fatal Push is obviously very important against the fast decks. I know that Ondrej lost to Wizards, which I understand is just the worst matchup for Kethis, and obviously Fatal Push is a very good tool at helping to win that. Lavinia is a really interesting choice here because I think Mono Green is also a tricky matchup specifically because of Karl the Great Creator. So Lavinia slowing the opponent in Mono Green Devotion down helps a lot, and I think it's also good in the mirror match because it stops the opponent casting Moxamba over and over again. Loran is obviously good against the artifact decks, as is Ruinous Blast, again, just a really good sweeper in general. Scarab God going to be good in the mid-range matchups. Urtai gives you a way to kill Karl the Great Creator once it's on the battlefield, and then Stonebrain, very good in the mirror match at just exiling Kethis. But also, I've heard that some people are running Guy's Blessing in their sideboard as a way to stop the opponent, you milling the opponent out. So Stonebrain can also double as a way to get rid of that. I have seen some of this running the old Jace, like the Laboratory Maniac version of Jace, as a way to win if the opponent does have something like a Guy's Blessing. But I think Stonebrain being good in the mirror match as well probably means that I prefer that over the 2. But yeah, Kethis, very, very strong deck, very hard deck to play. So if you're interested in learning this, definitely check out the article. I'll link it below. Then we've got some other mid-range decks. Like I said, Gen mid-range is the most popular deck this weekend. And Minsk and Boo is a really big reason to be in Jund, but I think the main reason why people have gone for Jund is because of Jarsel. I think Jarsel is an incredibly powerful card. Like I said earlier, we're already struggling to fit all the stuff in the Rakdos deck, so I'm not sure the slightly lower consistency in the mana base is worth the splash for Jarsel. If Crucius gets nerfed, then I could definitely see Jund being the way to go if Jarsel still sticks around, because it is an incredibly powerful card. There are some numbers in this deck that I'm not quite sure about. I think Seasoned Pyromancer is one of the best cards in the whole archetype. I get that double red in a 3-color deck is going to be harder to achieve, but I would almost always want to be running 4 Seasoned Pyromancer in any mid-range deck, so I'm not 100% sure about that. Another person who's gone for a split of top-end cards, which I do understand, right? You do want to have different stuff at the top end. I'm still more of a big fan of Crucius consistently tutoring one card, but I can definitely understand why people run splits just to diversify their threats a little bit. And then in Jarsel decks, I do like Abundant Harvest. Just make sure that you consistently have a 1-mana target in your graveyard for the Jarsel on turn 3, which is pretty nice. Perilous Iteration is another card that does a similar thing. I'm not sure on some of the numbers here. I'm sure that Karl tested this and thought that this was the right split, and then we've got some, decent splits of interaction. Shieldred's Edict is a card that I think is an interesting point in the deck. So in my older builds that were just running Fatal Push and Molten Impact, I do think that specifically if you're playing on ladder, that can leave you vulnerable to some random decks that are just running bigger creatures. So Shieldred's Edict working as a way that can kill bigger creatures, that can also get rid of stuff like Darksteel Citadel equipped with Soul Artifact is pretty important. So in my recent Rakdos build, I've started running 2 Shieldred's Edict just to give you an out to that, because otherwise you really struggle to beat that. So I do like 2 Shieldred's Edict. That's something that I'm pretty high on. And then a lot of interesting stuff in the sideboard here. Undercity Plunder is obviously going to be very good in the mid-range mirror matches. We've got some more interactions, some Graveyard Hate, some Sweepers. Sky Sovereign's an interesting one. Just a generically powerful card. Fade from History is also pretty interesting. So when I was running Crucius and stuff to tutor with it, I would always go Shatterstorm in the Rakdos builds, but I guess Fade from History works as essentially a Shatterstorm that also hoses the Enchantress deck. Now, Enchantress obviously isn't very popular, but I could see this just being slightly better than Shatterstorm. But having said that, in a 3-color deck, I do think the mana base is the biggest weakness. So needing green and reds for like Seasoned Pyromancer and Fade from History is a little bit rough. That's one other thing that I'm not 100% sure of in this particular list. I think in a 3-color list where you need red, green, and black, you really shouldn't be running Pathways in my opinion. And I did see a couple games where that did come back to bite Karl a little bit, but like I said, I haven't tested this deck yet, so it could be fine, but I would probably just want to be running all dual lands if possible, because, like I said, if you need double pips of each colour, cutting yourself off one colour with a Pathway, it can be very brutal going into longer games. And then another player with Slaughter Games and Knight of Souls Betrayal, so I'm obviously a big fan of this card, just to hose the Goblins matchup. This card can single-handedly flip the Goblins matchup on its head, so as long as you've got Crucius in the deck, I mean, they are only running 3 Crucius, so you're not guaranteed to find this that consistently, but this does seem like a very important tool to fight the Goblins matchup. The next up, we've got Simon Nielsen. So again, this is the same Reanimator deck as Matti Kuisma, so nothing too special to say about this, but this is a very nice archetype, and I'm definitely going to be trying it out myself to see how it performs. And we've got the first Artifacts player, so this is the bigger artifact deck, right? It's not a Lurrus build. We've got Gigantha as the companion here, and they're running Thought Monitor, and Emery's interesting. Most of these blue white affinity decks were running just the 4 Nettle Cyst, no Emery, whereas this build is only running 1 Nettle Cyst, which is interesting, and then Emery to get more value, I guess. And then this build is also running Machiko's Reign of Truth, so this is kind of a hybrid of the bigger blue-white affinity decks that we've seen in the past and the Lurrus versions. I think Machiko's is interesting because it does just close the game out a lot faster than Nettle Cyst. A lot of the time that these Thought Monitor Nettle Cyst variants would win, you'd get Nettle Cyst into play, get a Flyer into play, clog up the board, use Portable Hold to interact, and then equip the Nettle Cyst to your Flyers to attack for lethal, whereas Machiko's doesn't require a 5-mana investment to get that buff on one of your Flyers, so this is an interesting choice here. I think it is pretty appealing because I think the big appeal of the Lurrus versions is they just close the game out a lot faster, so it gives the opponent less time to find their Brotherhood's End, for example. And Machiko's Reign of Truth being an enchantment does enable you to play around the mass artifact removal a little bit better as well. So this is a very interesting build. It's weird to see 3 Ingenious Smith, but I'm definitely going to be trying this out and see what I think of it. But I do kind of like running 4 Machikos and slightly fewer Nettle Cysts, just because it gives you that speed and you're less vulnerable to the mass artifact removal. And then sideboard, interestingly, they've got Thalia and Elite Spellbinder here. I guess this is just good against the control decks. I do imagine that this deck has a very bad control matchup with Divine Purge, for example. So, I mean, I guess these cards don't really help to play around Divine Purge, but maybe this is here for like the Rakdos mirror matches so that you don't get, you can diversify your threat types and don't get blown out by Brotherhood's End. Then you've got Thieving Skydiver, which is obviously really sick in the mirror match. And then, extra copies of Metallic Rebuke and Fragment Reality. So interesting to see kind of a hybrid build of the bigger affinity and the Lurrus builds. And I'm definitely going to be trying this out and see what I think of it. Then next up, this is the other build of Kethis that we saw from the tournament. So this is different from Ondrej Strasky's build. This is basically more built like a mid-range deck, and less all in on the combo because you're not running stuff like Relic of Legends. So this is a build that is running 4 Fatal Push in the main deck and is also running Jarsil. So this deck is going to be much more able to grind into longer games, if that makes sense. But you are going to be less linear, slightly less fast at comboing off because you're not running stuff like Relic of Legends. But this is a really interesting build. I think Jarsil is a really effective tool to grind into longer games. Now, having said that, Graveyard Hate is one of the best tools against Kethis, so having Jarsil in addition to Kethis and Emery as another thing that needs to interact with the graveyard to go off does seem a little bit sketchy. But having seen these lists, I do think there are definitely going to be meta games where this is better. So for example, like I said, I think Izzet Wizards is probably the worst matchup, or just the very fast aggressive decks is going to be the worst matchup for Strasky's version of Kethis Combo. So having 4 Fatal Push in the main and you can flash them back with Jarsil does seem like, if you're expecting aggro, this build does seem better. But in metagames where there aren't aggro, I do think I prefer Strasky's build, but this is definitely an interesting way to build it. The one weird thing about this deck that I'm not really sure about is why they're running Jace Wheel of Mysteries in the main deck with Gigantha in the sideboard. The only two options I can think of that make sense here is either there are a lot of matchups where they board it out, so they don't have Gigantha game 1, and then the matchups where they board it out, they do have access to Gigantha, or maybe they swap this into the main deck at the last minute and forgot that you can't companion the Gigantha. I do understand why you want the Jace Wheel of Mysteries here in a lot of situations, if you just can't mill the opponent out for whatever reason, but I think if you're running Gigantha, it might be better to just run this in the sideboard for the matchups where that is the case. But either way, very interesting build of the deck. I'm definitely going to be trying it out. And like I said, if you want to run Kethis and you're expecting fast aggressive decks, a build with 4 Fatal Push in the main deck does seem pretty appealing. Then sideboard-wise, Sky Sovereigns are going to be nice as extra interaction. Arasta is going to be, extra insulation against the Spellslinger decks like Wizards and Phoenix, which seems like a nice tool. Had these Kethis decks been in the top 8, they might have had a better chance against the Izzet decks that ended up getting to the finals. And then nothing too special outside of that, really. Just some extra pieces of interaction. Lae'zel is obviously going to be a very good tool against the Rakdos decks because it has inherent protection from the single target removal. So very interesting build of Kethis here. Like I said, I think if you're expecting a very fast metagame, this is probably going to be the better choice going forwards. Then we've got another Rakdos Midrange. So I think this is the same build we saw earlier with the Bone Crusher Giant. So nothing extra to go over here. And then we've got another Jan Midrange deck. So this is another version that's running Minsc and Boo at the top end. No shielded in the main deck, which is interesting here. But like I said, I'm a big fan of running Crucius and just one tutor target at the top end. And if you expect a lot of mid-range matchups, I do think having Minsc and Boo at the top end is really good in this particular metagame, right? This is a very, very powerful card at the top end. So I could understand why you would want to run Minsc and Boo at the top end. Plus, it's another reason to justify being in green. As long as Crucius is around, I still think just going straight black-red is better for consistency's sake, particularly in the mana base. But if you are splashing green, Minsc and Boo is another good reason to do that. I really like 4 Crucius for Jarsil. This build isn't running Seasoned Pyromancer or Fable of the Mirror Breaker, which is interesting. I can understand in Jund why you might not want to run Seasoned Pyromancer because it does put more pressure on your mana base, needing double red. But yeah, interesting build here. Teachings of the Kirin is a card that I've never really understood. I get that it mills your graveyard to more consistently enable the Jarsil, and it is just a decent mid-range threat, but I feel the quality of cards we have access to in both Rakdos and Jund feels like a weird choice to be running this card. Maybe I'm missing something though. Let me in the comments if you know why this card is better than, I don't know, it just feels quite a mid card to me personally, but you could be running Bloodtithe Harvester, you could be running Tarmogoyf. That's the big thing about this list that I'm not 100% sure about is you have no pressure. I guess Teachings of the Kirin does put stuff on the battlefield, but you have nothing to commit to the battlefield before turn 3, and I think that is going to be a problem in matchups. Well, the thing with these mid-range decks is you need to start applying pressure to stop the opponent top decking out of your early interaction, and so I think if I was to change this deck, I would probably want to be running at least some Bloodtithe Harvester or Tarmogoyf or Arcanist maybe. I get Teachings of the Kirin does commit to the board, and I guess it does put the counters on your creatures as well, so you do get at least a 2/2 off it, but it just feels like this card doesn't really provide that much impact. Personally, maybe I'm wrong, I haven't played with it recently, so I could be missing something there maybe, but yeah, rest of the deck, this does seem very interactive. You got Perilous Iteration for extra ways to grind, so this particular build does seem very well set up for the mid-range mirror matches, so I think it is quite well built for a weekend where you expect a lot of mid-range, right? Minsc can be very good in the mid-range matchups. Perilous Iteration, providing a 2-for-1, is obviously going to be very good as well. And then sideboard-wise, nothing too special here. Shaper Sanctuary is interesting. This is going to be very good in the mid-range matchups as well, but like I said, you don't really have that many actual threats in the deck. I guess it's a good way to protect your Crucius and Jarsil, which is pretty nice, but if I was running Shaper Sanctuary, I'd probably want to be running a slightly higher creature count. Back to Nature is interesting as a way to hose Enchantress decks, but I feel like Fade from History is probably better as just a card that is also very good against the artifact decks, maybe. And then I guess another advantage to not running Seasoned Pyromancer is you do get access to Gigantha, which is another way to help you pull ahead in the mid-range matchup. So, maybe if you're running Jund, no Seasoned Pyromancer and Gigantha could be a way to go, but I'm really high on Seasoned Pyromancer personally, so. And then Obnixis is interesting, probably for the control matchups as well. So, interesting build. I would probably want to be running more creatures, but obviously they did very well, and this build does seem very well set up for the mid-range mirror matches, so seems like a very good meta call for the weekend. Then we've got another Kethis combo, so this is the same build before we saw with Jarsil, so nothing extra to add there. So this is the Rakdos Goblins list. Like I said, I did expect there to be slightly more Rakdos Goblins, because I do feel like this is the deck that has one of the best matchups against the mid-range metagame, and this list looks very similar to the list that I posted shortly after the Runveld Hordemaster came out. Right, we've got Prospector, Expert, Battlecry Goblin, Snoop. So yeah, 3 Pashlink Mons for Fable. This looks like just the generic mid-range list that I posted a while back. Some changes to the mana base here. They've got a single copy of Mutavault, which makes sense, right? Just an extra land that also counts as a goblin, in addition to 4 Den of the Bugbear, which I like. So 25 lands I think is important in Goblins, and having extra utility lands is very nice. So 4 Den 1 Mutavault makes a lot of sense to me. Then sideboard also quite similar to the sideboard I posted. I really like the 4 Chandra Gesture Kill against the control decks. Fatal Push is obviously very important against the aggro decks. Trash Master, very good against the artifact decks. Hidetsugu Consumes All is interesting. I guess that's another hoser for the artifact decks if you expect them to be popular. And then a little bit of extra interaction I feel is important, because decks like Izzet Wizards are the toughest matchup. So yeah, pretty similar to the list I posted a while back. And I think this deck was a very good metagame call into mid-range. So kind of surprised more people didn't bring it. Trying to see what record they had. So they ended up going 3-2 with it, which is pretty respectable, losing to Kethis Combo, which I feel would be a very tough matchup. And they did lose to Jump mid-range, which is interesting. It would be quite interesting to see if I could find that game. But yeah, I did expect to see a little bit more Rakdos Goblins, but this does seem like a very good build into a mid-range metagame. Then this is another Kethis Combo, same Jarsil build as before. So this looks like a different Reanimator deck. So I think 2 different teams bought Reanimator. And the main differences here is that they're running Shieldred. They're also running Elesh Norn and Ceres Emissary in addition to Atraxa. So this build has a lot more reanimation targets, and they're running Faithless Looting. So this is just much more pure Reanimator and less mid-range compared to the other decks, which again I think is not a bad call for this weekend, because in general I think there's definitely a lack of graveyard hate for this weekend. Since Reanimator did well, since Phoenix did well, and Kethis is now a deck, I could see more graveyard hate being popular going forward. So I think if I was to play Reanimator on the ladder going forwards, I would personally prefer the build by Matti Kuisma and Simon Nielsen in their team, for example, because they're much more built like a mid-range deck, so you're less vulnerable to graveyard hate. Whereas this build seems much more all-in. Now, having said that, I do think that Reanimator is generally better the faster it can go off. But like I said, if the metagame does adapt to these lists and starts running more graveyard hate, this kind of list that has less of a backup plan becomes more risky to do so. Running Ceres Emissary and Elesh Norn does mean that you can't run Gigantha, so you can't hardcast the Atraxa. So I do think that is another way that you don't have as good a backup plan, but you know, if there's less graveyard hate, this does seem like a better way to build a deck, because you can go off quicker. Then sideboard-wise, Shieldred Assimilator is an interesting card. I do feel like this does have potential, particularly if you do want to pivot to a more mid-range role. You know, 3-1 Menace is hard to block in the early game, and it's just good if you want extra graveyard hate and extra threats, which makes sense. You know, maybe they felt like post-sideboard, if there was graveyard hate, they wouldn't have enough threats. So if you're against another graveyard deck, this seems quite good. And then the rest of the stuff seems, you know, nothing too crazy going on in the sideboard there. But yeah, like I said, I think this was a great call for this tournament. But if graveyard hate becomes more popular, I would probably prefer to play Team Handshake's version of the deck. So this is another Reanimator deck. This is, I imagine Leo must have tested with Simon Nielsen and Matti Kuisma, same deck. You know, like I said, very good if graveyard hate becomes more popular compared to the other version. This is another Kethis with the Jarsil deck, so nothing to really add here. Then we've got another Rakdos Midrange deck here. I guess the main differences here is Misery Shadow in the main, which is interesting. So I'm not 100% sure what specific decks they want to shut off the graveyard synergies for. You know, if they expected Mono Green Devotion, this is obviously going to be good against Old Growth Troll and Cavalier of Thorns. Against Goblins, it's going to shut off the Runveld Hordemaster triggers. And I guess, you know, decks that just want to fill the graveyard up, it's going to be useful against. And I guess it is just another powerful 2-drop threat as well. But I'm not 100% sure exactly what they're trying to target in the metagame with this. Maybe I'm missing something. Definitely let me know in the comments if you think I am. This is another build that's choosing to run Arcanist over Bloodtithe Harvester, which, like I said, I think is a very interesting choice. I think they're very close cards. And like I said, for this weekend, Graveyard Hate, not expected to be super popular. So I think Arcanist in that sort of format is potentially better than Bloodtithe Harvester for that reason. Sky Sovereign is interesting here. as just an extra top-end card that's good against other creature decks, for example. So, plus not many people are going to be expecting this either. So, interesting choice. Like I said, I think I prefer just having shielded with Crucius and maybe sideboarding this for matchups where it's good. But like I said, I can understand why people run a split at the top end. And then, nothing. Oh, they've also got Invoke Despair, which is interesting. So they have got quite a diverse lot of top-end threats, which if you're expecting a lot of mid-range decks is important, because the risk in a mid-range mirror of having just Crucius and Shieldred is, once you have Shieldred in play, that's kind of all your top-end threats, whereas at least with this sort of build, you can keep hitting Sky Sovereigns and Invoke Despairs off your Crucius by picking Ambitious, which is interesting. And then nothing too special outside of that. 4 Crucius, 4 Season Pyromancer, 4 Fable is good. I'm not a big fan of running only 25 lands in these sorts of decks, because missing your third land drop when you need to cast Crucius, Pyro, or Fable is so important, and they all filter your hand anyway, so there's way less risk of floods. So personally, I'm a big fan of 25 lands in these decks where you really want your third land on curve in every single game, but I can understand that 24 lands is going to get you there most of the time. And then sideboard, nothing too special going on here. Chosen to go for Relic of Progenitus over Unlicensed Hearse, which I think makes sense, right? I think if you're expecting Kethis particularly, then Graveyard Hate that exiles the whole graveyard is very important. I think Soulguide Lantern is much, much better against Kethis than Unlicensed Hearse, for example. So I can understand why they've gone for Relic here. And then, I guess Rending Volley is an interesting pick as well, but nothing too special in the sideboard outside of that. But, pretty well built mid-range deck overall, I think, here. Then next up we've got, so this is the more aggro Azorius Artifacts deck. This is very similar to the Metatech deck that I posted recently. I guess the only change they've made to the main deck here from the looks of things is they've gone down on Metatech and main deck Metallic Rebuke, which I think is, a perfectly good swap here. Metatech is definitely a card that is worse in multiples unless you can consistently connect. I like running 4 Metatech in my build because I really think that Metatech is much more impactful on turn 2. I very much see this as a tempo card where if you can get an evasive 1-drop artifact creature into Metatech on turn 2, not only does it pull your head on card advantage, but it can meaningfully increase your clock as well, because say you have like Vault Scourge, Metatech, and Ornithopter, and you seek a Retrofitter Foundry on turn 2, that massively increases your clock on turn 3, because for 1 mana you can now make a 4/4. Similarly, if you had Vault Scourge, Metatech, and a Darksteel Citadel, and you seek an Ensoul Artifact, on turn 3 that represents a 5/5 haste indestructible as well. So I like running 4 Metatech because it maximizes your chances of seeking on turn 2, which I feel is the best way to use the card, but I can completely understand going down to 3 copies if you don't want to draw it in multiples, and Metallic Rebuke is a generically good card anyway. Plus, actually thinking about it, in open deck lists, I think main decking while Metallic Rebuke is a really good idea, because you make the opponent constantly have to play around it just by running that 1 copy in your main deck. So in open deck lists, I do think running that single Metallic Rebuke in the main is a really good idea. And then sideboard wise, I guess Damping Sphere is interesting here. This is good against both Mono Green Devotion and Kethis Combo. So this is definitely a card that has gone up in value in the sideboard since Kethis Combo has become more popular. And then Fight as one is interesting, is protection from removal as well, which is interesting. So yeah, I especially like the Rebuke in the main deck if you're running an open deck list tournament. Next up we've got Grixis Midrange. So this is essentially Rakdos Midrange splashing blue for additional counter spells and Rusko, which is interesting. Rusko is a very generically powerful card, so having this as another top end card that you can get off Crucius is really nice. Now I'm not sure, maybe I might try out a Grixis build just with Rusko at the top end, because this is a very, very powerful card. The other thing you get from Splashing Blue, like I said, you get counter spells. They've got 2 Spell Pierce in the main deck, which is not something you expect against a Rakdos deck, and this does seem like it can blow out certain decks, which is really nice. Drown in the Lock, very generically powerful card as well. And then sideboard-wise, I think they're trying to maximize Crucius here with some nice top-end cards that they can tutor. Hostage Taker is interesting. I'm not 100% sure what matchups you would want this over something like a Ravenous Chupacabra, for example. Maybe you can let me know in the comments if you can think of an application for specifically Hostage Taker over something like that. Extra Counterspell and Spell Pierce is obviously going to be really good. Now, I'm not 100% sure personally that I'm the biggest fan of splashing blue for counterspells in Grixis midrange, because I feel like Rakdos already naturally has a good matchup against Control, which is seemingly where you would want the counterspells. But I guess Spell Pierce is generically good against a ton of different decks in the format right now anyway, because it's so efficient and a lot of decks are running impactful non-creature spells. I guess actually in the mirror match it could be good because you can stop stuff like Fable of the Mirror Breaker, although I don't know, I feel like maybe you'd want something like Make Disappear as a way to counter their 3-drops potentially, but, you know, Spell Pierce is generically good anyway. Extra Bind to Secrecy, and then Gaia's Blessing, an interesting tech, so they obviously did probably expect some number of Kethis to be running this in the sideboard, so this does seem like a decent sideboard tech against the Kethis decks going forward, which is nice. And then next up we've got Mardu Reanimator, so again, this is the same list that Matti Kuisma and Simon Nielsen were running, so nothing new to add here. Another Jan midrange deck here. Interesting they're running Liliana of the Veil in the main deck. I'm really not a fan of this card in the main deck right now. I just feel like it's so easy to attack down. I think it's very good in the sideboard against control and other decks where they're running, you know, going taller rather than bigger. And I feel like there are so many good 3-drops in the format that they're running Liliana over something like Seasoned Pyromancer here and Fable of the Mirror Breaker, so I'm not a huge fan of this. I guess if they expected the format to be slower because it's loads of mid-range mirror matches, then I can understand that a little bit more. And then the rest of the deck, interestingly, they're running Gargaroth as a tutor target of Crucius, which is very interesting. I could see this being a good choice, particularly if you expect there to be a lot of aggro decks. To be honest, thinking about it, if most of the mid-range decks are relying on stuff like Molten Impact and Fatal Push, Gargaroth seems very good in the control mirror matches as well, because the current interaction suite just doesn't line up particularly well against it. Plus, it just guarantees that you're going to be able to beat stuff like Izzet Phoenix and Izzet Wizards as well. So Gargaroth is definitely an interesting choice to be able to tutor off Crucius in these Jund lists. They're going for Tarmogoyf on the 2-drop slot over Bloodtithe Harvester and Arcanist, which is defensible. I think that makes sense. You know, it's another reason to splash green. I mean, personally, I think I still prefer Bloodtithe Harvester. And if I was going to run Jund, I would probably just have a light splash for Jarsil, because this is definitely the big reason to be in Jund, in my opinion, I think. But they've also got Grizzly Salvage here, which is interesting. It's just a way to tutor their creatures. I think you need a higher creature count to be able to enable this, but filling the graveyard for Croxa of Grizzly Salvage does seem pretty nice, and it obviously fills the graveyard for Jarsil. You know, like I said, I think this is another player who's identified that graveyard hate isn't super popular for this weekend. Like I said, I think one of the things that could change in the metagame going forwards because of the decklist from this weekend is people run more graveyard hate, so I'm not sure I'd be comfortable running something like this, but for this weekend, this does seem like an interesting choice. And then Assassin's Trophy just giving you answer to generically, like, for every threat is really huge. I think one of the big weaknesses of just straight Rakdos is you're outside of Invoke Despair, you don't have a good way to deal with enchantments, so Trophy being a way to deal with enchantments is really nice as well. And then sideboard wise, Sarkhan is interesting here. I did not expect to see this card brought this weekend, and I'm honestly not 100% sure what this is for. I guess it's just another generic threat. Planeswalkers are going to be good against control. This does also seem like it could be very good in the mirror matches as well. I think Ancient Grudge is a very, very good card against the Artifacts decks, obviously, and then a little bit more interaction. I'm not 100% sure about Phyrexian Arena. I feel like Black Market Connections is potentially better. I guess this is another card for the mirror matches because, like I said, Rakdos really struggles to deal with enchantments, so this can help you pull ahead in the mirror matches. But very interesting build here. I think Gargaroth is interesting. I think Salvage with Croxa and a slightly higher creature count is interesting. Like I said, if Graveyard Hate becomes more popular, this might be a bit risky, but interesting innovations in this list for sure. Then we got another Jund mid-range deck. So, you know, same sort of thing. Got Minsc and Boot at the top end here. And that is their only top end card. That's interesting. So Minsc and Boot will be consistently tutored off Crucius here, which I quite like. I think Minsc and Boot is a very nice reason to be in Jund as well, and Crucius ramping you into this on turn 4 is very nice. Jarsil here, another good reason to be running green. They're running Arcanist alongside Jarsil, so very all in on the graveyard, but I think these pair really nicely together because they both pay you off for running a lot of 1-mana interaction, right? They've got Abundant Harvest, Thoughtseize Inquisition, Fatal Push here, and Cling to Dust as well, so you got 2 cards in Jarsil and Arcanist that pay you off for running a lot of 1-mana interaction, which is very nice. Now again, if Graveyard Hate becomes more popular going forwards, this could be a little bit more risky, but we'll have to see how quickly the metagame adapts. And then outside of that, nothing too special. I think Riveteer's Charm is a very interesting card. You know, I think this is very generically powerful, but the 3-drop slot is so packed in these Jund mid-range decks that you do lose out. You know, you could potentially be running Seasoned Pyromancer or Fable of the Mirror Breaker in this slot instead, which... So, I don't know, I feel if I was to run a deck with Jarsil and Arcanist, I'd probably want to run a lot more 1-mana cards. Like, I'd probably go for Abundant Harvest over the Riveteer's Charm, but very interesting build here for sure. And then, sideboard-wise, nothing too special here, I don't think. Davriel's Withering is an interesting card if you're running Arcanist, and Jarsil to flashback. Slaughter Games, again, I think this card is going to be very good if you're using Crucius as a tutor package against the Kethis decks. Another Fade from History player here. Like I said, this could potentially just be an upgrade over Shatterstorm if you want to have an out to the Enchantress deck as well. Vraska is interesting as another card to swap in for Minsc and Boo. I'm not sure exactly what matchups you would prefer to have Vraska over the Minsc and Boo, so maybe let me know in the comments if you can think of that. And then Thragtusk is interesting. Again, I'm not sure what matchups you would prefer to have this over an Elder Gargroth, for example, but again, you can let me know. And then Davriel Shadow Mage seems... I mean, this obviously seems very good against control. Maybe you want this in the mirror match as well, but yeah, a lot of interesting choices here for sure. Then we've got another Jan Midrange player. So this player's running Prosper Tomebound in addition to Shielded, which is interesting. I've always thought that Prosper is a very powerful card, especially in these mid-range mirrors. Again, if you expect a lot of mid-range, Prosper is very good at pulling you ahead on card advantage. Only 3 Jarsil is interesting. I feel like this is probably the biggest reason to be in green, so not going 4 seems a little weird here. I guess the green splash is also for Tarmogoyf here. So they're running 4 Goy, 4 Harvester, which I quite like. I do feel if you're running Jund, the big advantage of running green is that you can run another powerful beat stick in addition to Blood Tide Harvester, so you can actually start closing games out a lot quicker, which is pretty nice. And then sideboard-wise, nothing too special going on here. I do like Chandra Awakened Inferno off Crucius against the control matchups, but you already have a good control matchup anyway, so I'm not 100% sure you need to dedicate that. So I've recently swapped Chandra out for Invoke Despair in my lists, which is a card I feel is good against control and also gives you an out to enchantments as well. But I think this is just obviously very good against the control matchups anyway, if you want to improve that. And then Kethis is interesting. I've always felt like this is going to be a good card in mid-range matchups maybe, so this weekend, if you're expecting a lot of mid-range mirrors, it's good. But if you want Graveyard hate, I feel like it's just generally too slow in most situations. A lot of decks that are interacting with the Graveyard can fill their Graveyard and go off the same turn, like Kethis Combo and Reanimator. So I think if you want this for Graveyard hate, you're probably better off running something like more Unlicensed Hearse or Soul Guide Lantern. But in mid-range mirrors, I could see this just being a good card to pull your head on damage. Then we've got another Jund mid-range deck here. And... this looks pretty similar. Oh, we got the Riveteer's Charm. Okay, so I think this is the same list that we saw a couple of deck lists ago, so nothing new to add to this, I don't think. Another Jund mid-range deck. Oh, okay, this is the exact same deck list that we just saw, so again, nothing to add to that, really. And then we've got Jeskai Creativity, which is interesting. I do think Serra's Emissary is a card that a lot of decks aren't prepared to beat right now, particularly Game 1. And then you do have good targets post-sideboard. So I've recently been working on some creativity lists that pivot into Tyrannix Rex post-sideboard against interactive decks like Rakdos Midrange and Control. So I do think that creativity or like transmogrified decks with Emissary Game 1 pivoting in Tyrannix Rex post-sideboard do have potential. So they're running Jeskai here, which is interesting. I think Wandering Emperor pairs very nicely with Indomitable Creativity. Hard Evidence is another, really nice card with the creativity because it gives you 2 tokens straight away. And then 5 Prophecy is a way to put back any Serra's Emissaries that you draw. Being Jeskai also helps you hardcast the Emissary, which can be pretty nice. And then some extra pieces of interaction here. And sideboard. So interestingly, they've got Locust God and Sage of the Falls sideboard. So I guess there were probably specific matchups where they wanted to just win with a combo rather than relying on Emissary, which is interesting. But I feel like most decks... Well, I feel like it's harder to set up creativity for X=2 if your main deck's not set up to do that, right? I've recently been working on creativity, and if you want to X=2, not running stuff like Big Score makes it harder to do. But I guess there would be certain matchups where you just want to kill on the spot rather than relying on Emissary. Then they've got Nezahal and Niv Mizzet Paran, which I guess they swap in against the control decks, which seems pretty good way to close it out. Again, I'm personally a bigger fan of Tyrannix Rex just because it closes the games out straight away and is very hard for them to deal with, but I could see this just being good enough against the control decks on its own. Then next up, we've got Mono White Auras. So this is from Benton Madsen, who obviously got second at the recent Pro Tour with Auras playing it in Pioneer. And this is very interesting. So they've gone for Mono White here to enable ossification, which is a few days before I saw the deck list for this tournament, I was actually thinking about building this deck with ossification myself. But when I was in the deck building process, I wasn't really sure it was worth it because I feel like Auras is a deck where you don't really want to interact Game 1. You just want to do your thing as fast as possible. And then post-sideboard, you obviously have access to stuff like Portable Hole. But maybe there's something in the metagame they were targeting with this. But I don't know. I feel like with this particular list, you've got 4 mana Confluence as the only land that can produce off-color stuff, and you are running Kaya's Ghost Form, Immolation, Hammer Hand, and Audacity as off-color auras that are basically just uncastable when you don't draw your Mana Confluence. Now, I do get from having played the 4-color auras decks in the past that the mana base can be a little sketchy sometimes, but being able to, you can diversify the amount of auras that you run, being in blue or green as your secondary color. So I don't know, I'm not sure that ossification is worth it personally, just because I don't feel like auras wants to interact that much, really, and you have good options to interact post-sideboard in matchups where it's important. Like Portable Hold is just 1 mana cheaper, which is really huge against decks like Izzet Wizards. And if you do want to have removal, quote unquote, for bigger creatures like Serra's Emissary, you also have Kaya's Ghost Form. So I'm not sure ossification is worth it personally. Again, I might be missing something. I didn't test this deck for the tournament, so if there's a specific reason why you think ossification would be good in the current metagame, definitely let me know in the comments. And then sideboard, like I said, Portable Hold, extra interaction, which is nice. Relic is extra graveyard, or as just graveyard hate in general. Obviously a good call right now with Kethis and Reanimator being everywhere. Like I said, this graveyard hate, type of graveyard hate that can just exile the graveyard all in one go, is going to be a lot better against Kethis Combo. Hushbringer is obviously great in auras against a lot of different decks. Disenchant is interesting. I'm not sure this is better than Fragment Reality, because it's just 1 mana cheaper. And Auras doesn't really care about giving the opponent a 1-drop, but there might be a reason they've gone for this instead. I do like the Selfless Savior in the sideboard in addition to Skrelv for the interactive matchups. Just makes it very difficult for the opponent to blow you out with interaction in the first few turns. And then Apostle of Purifying Light is also interesting against the Rakdos decks, but again, I do feel like most of the Rakdos decks are also running red base removal, whether that's Molten Impact or Strangle or Fiery Impulse, so doesn't seem like a guaranteed way to blow them out, but if you can get this in play and start putting auras on it, I guess it grows out of range of the red damage base removal pretty quickly, so it could be a very effective tool against the Rakdos decks anyway. But, with Shadows over Innistrad Remastered coming out later today, and we're getting Invisible Stalker, I'm not sure you would really need this sort of card anymore. And then finally we've got Hammer Time, so I don't think this deck did particularly well in the tournament, which is a shame because it is a really sweet one, but we've got a lot of spicy inclusions here, so we've got Kemba's Outfitter, which is just a staple in the archetype. This is, one of the main reasons I'm really excited for this archetype and Historic. Wilson is very interesting. So they're running Resolute Strike as a way to equip the hammer, and Wilson having Ward, Reach, and Trample is a pretty sick target to equip the hammer to. Now, having said that, I'm really not a big fan of Resolute Strike. I think, particularly into a mid-range metagame, you can get blown out so easily, just the opponent killing your creature with a hammer on it already, that if the opponent kills a creature that you're targeting with a Resolute Strike, that's pretty rough. Now, the big thing I like about this deck is that it is very all-in on killing quickly, right? If the opponent doesn't have early interaction, this deck can pretty effectively kill on turn 2 or 3. They've got the Cacophony Scamp Resolute Strike combo. They've got Thud as a way to just deal the last points of damage. Board the Weatherlight is an interesting inclusion that I hadn't thought of. So it finds a historic card, so it can find your belt or your hammer or portable hole or any of your legendary creatures. Now, obviously, this is quite a bit worse than something like Assemble the Team. And it's interesting that they're not running Ingenious Smith. I feel like Ingenious Smith, although I guess Ingenious Smith, the issue with that card is you don't really get that much value off the creature. Once we get Sigarda's Aid, and then we can run Sigarda's Aid with Kemba's Outfitter, I think Ingenious Smith is generally a lot better because you can then consistently equip the Smith itself with the hammer. But Board the Weatherlight is an interesting card if you're not going to run green-black for Assemble the Team as a way to find your hammer if you didn't want to run the Ingenious Smith. And then sideboards, Loran's Escape is nice at protecting both your creatures and the hammer or the belt itself. Containment Priest is interesting against decks that are trying to cheat stuff into play. Like, obviously this would be very good against the Creativity deck, for example. And obviously it's just going to be good against stuff like Muxus as well. So a few decks that this is going to be very good against. Shadow Spear is a way to gain life. They've got one in the main, one in the side, which I like quite a lot in these equipment-based decks. Drannith Magistrate is interesting. I guess this is quite good against the Kethis deck. So this seems like quite a good metagame call there. But again, I feel like there are potentially better options against Kethis that you could run, maybe. Unchained Berserker is interesting, giving you protection from white. Maybe the expected decks with white-based interaction like Blue-White Control could be popular, maybe. and then some extra pieces of interaction then. So it's a shame this deck didn't do particularly well, but with Sigarda's Aid coming out, I do think you're kind of spoilt for choice for ways to build the hammer deck, and I'm definitely going to be building it going forward. So those are all the decks. I'm not sure how long this video is going to be because I was rambling for quite a while, but I thought it could be interesting to break down these decks. Definitely let me know in the comments what you thought of the decks, if there were any applications that I missed, because, you know, my concern when doing these sorts of videos is I haven't played with all of these decks, and I'm sure all of these players playtested quite a lot, so I'm sure there are some things in these deck lists that I'm missing. You know, there's a reason they went for a specific card over another, so, you know, particularly with stuff like Bone Crusher Giant in that Rakdos Midrange deck, there could be applications there that I missed, for example, so let me know in the comments if there's anything you think I might have missed. Like I said, Shadows of Innistrad Remastered coming out later today. I'm going to be doing a ton of testing with that, so I should hopefully have some new videos with the new cards to come out soon, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Big up!